Hello and welcome to episode 3 of 5-Year Windows on the Movie Gold YouTube channel. I'm your host, Kyle McNevin. Each week, this series focuses on a specific 5-year period of an actor's career by looking at all of their movies released during that time. On this week's episode, we'll be looking at the career of Al Pacino from 1971 to 1975. Not to set the bar too high before even getting into his career, but this 5-year run from Pacino could stack up against any other actor's 5-year run. This 5-year period only features 6 movies, but all 6 of these movies are what I would classify as great movies, perfectly illustrating the old adage of quality over quantity. By choosing this time period, we're going to cover his first lead role, which comes in 1971, all the way to 1975, which completes his 4th straight year with an Oscar nomination. Sure, he ends up winning that first Oscar in the early 90s with Scent of a Woman, but this 5-year window could go on to define his entire career, not just because these movies have such a treasured reputation, but the standout performances from Pacino have become eternally tied to those movies as well. I'm someone that really appreciates some of his later work, specifically in the 90s, but even I can't argue against how undeniable this time period proves to be in cementing the legacy of one of the greats. Before 1971, the only screen performance that Pacino had to his name was a brief role in the 1969 movie Me, Natalie, which starred Patty Duke. Pacino's other acting experience had come on the stage where he was working fairly regularly, and even after his big breakout in the early 70s, he continues to return to the theater. It's obviously not news to anyone that an actor had some stage experience before working their way to the big screen. For me, Pacino exudes that theatricality in his performances that I feel like allows him to reach that next level in scenes, especially where he's having to balance his patented intensity with a humanity that can let the audience connect with his character's sadness as well. As usual, there may be some plot points from these 6 movies today that I talk about in quite a bit of detail, so be warned that they're probably going to be spoilers for the following movies: Panic in Needle Park, The Godfather, Scarecrow, The Godfather Part 2, Serpico, and Dog Day Afternoon. As was alluded to earlier, the first lead role for Pacino comes in 1971 with Panic in Needle Park from director Jeffrey Schatzberg and released on July 13, 1971. The movie tells the story of a woman, played by Kitty Wynn, living in New York City that gets led into a world of drugs by a character played by Al Pacino. Pacino is still a large part of the movie, and he is able to shine here, but I think it would be a disservice to the movie not to start by talking about how fully realized the performance from Kitty Wynn is. After watching this movie, I had to look her up and see if I had seen her in anything else, and just forgot about seeing her. But this was my first time seeing a Kitty Wynn movie, and like Pacino, this was her second movie appearance. She is carrying the burden in the movie of the audience needing to sympathize with and understand her. A lot of her role is being confronted with some weird Pacino circumstances or behaviors and being able to rationalize that she needs to stay in the situation. Yes, being able to use the crutch of, well, she's on drugs and she's dependent on him, carries a lot of narrative weight. But specifically her face acting is what sells it all for me. She's conveying this level of knowing that some of the things that Pacino is saying just aren't true, and that he's quite frankly full of it. Nonetheless, her performance was one of the standouts of the series for me, and if you haven't seen this, I suggest doing so for Kitty Wynn alone. When you move to the Pacino side of things, I've already mentioned that the person he's playing may not be the most trustworthy, but for someone in their first big role, I think he's already showing his proficiency in not making this someone that is sinister, but rather someone that has just been absorbed by his surroundings and this is all that he knows. We'll get to a couple movies later on where he gets to use that sinister edge. In this case, he is treated as a product of the community that is formed in New York City with a bunch of folks that know no other way to survive than hustling on the streets for their next fix. As a recent retrospective points out, the film's refusal to embrace melodrama or flinch from close-up injections is further underlined by the lack of background music at all. The lack of melodrama helps Pacino and Wynn immensely because they don't need to have these overly contrived emotional interrogations with each other. Instead, they have mostly disjointed conversations that don't amount to much, because either one or both of them are high out of their minds. I think even beyond the uncompromising shots of the drug use in the movie, it also is able to stir up some upsetting situations out of everyday life. All I'm going to say is that our 2 main characters are on a ferry at one point, and while they're doing drugs, they lose something over the edge of the boat. That moment literally made me pause the movie and take a couple of deep breaths. The last element that I want to touch on is the great tagline of the movie, which was "God help Bobby and Helen." Now that is a tagline that will get you in the movie theater, because you have to find out what the hell are Bobby and Helen up to. It also speaks to the sentiment of the times where the individuals caught up in the hardcore drug scene were lost, and all you could do is give them your prayers. As one of the first time watches for me, this set the stage perfectly for what was to come. I can see where this kind of character work by Pacino becomes appealing for his role as Michael Corleone in The Godfather. But in this case, he is a sympathetic figure that you feel like is partly let down by some aspects of American society. This now brings us to The Godfather, which premiered on March 24th, 1972, and was directed by Francis Ford Coppola. In case you don't know, The Godfather focuses on the happenings within the Corleone family, which is mainly charting the ascent of Michael Corleone, played by Al Pacino, to the head of the family. The Godfather has actually been in the news lately because it is the 50th anniversary of the movie and all, and Diane Keaton had mentioned that the creative forces behind the movie didn't actually want to cast Pacino, which makes sense in the regard that this is an actor who only has one major role to his name, and trusting him with providing the narrative spine of the movie probably felt a little abrupt at this point. Where I will provide some pushback is that after watching Panic in Needle Park, it's plainly obvious that this guy has the goods and could handle this role. One of the more overt themes in the film is the idea of a family legacy. The way The Godfather approaches it is that there is a vacancy on the throne of the family after the patriarch Don Vito Corleone is attacked, and there is now this lack of direction for the family. Michael Corleone knows that he needs to restore order to his family, and it doesn't seem like he's really relishing that chance either. Pacino is able to keep this performance focused on the idea that he sees this as an obligation, and that this decision has been made for him. It feels really weird to talk about all the smart things that this does, because everyone knows how picture perfect a lot of the movie is. But another aspect of this that is so well crafted is the setup of Michael as the outsider in the family. He's the college and military man that has already left the family once, and what's to say that won't happen again? As Pacino is taking a firmer hold on the family, that weight is clearly there, and that he's having to prove to his family that he can be just as ruthless and authoritarian as his father. The smart part of all of this is the subtext mainly stays a subtext. Outside of a couple of passing remarks, that's really all you get. The Godfather lets that be the driving force for him, and what allows Pacino to deliver this kind of dialed-in performance. Despite the critical and commercial acclaim, there still was some controversy when it came time for the Oscar nominations. The Godfather received 3 out of 5 supporting actor Oscar nominations, which is pretty unheard of. In one of the first discussions of category fraud, Al Pacino didn't even attend these Oscars because he was so upset that he was nominated as a supporting rather than a lead actor. Which, after watching the movie, it is a befuddling decision since the movie is telling the story of Michael Corleone climbing to the mountain of the mafia family. To rub even more salt in the wound, Joel Grey in Cabaret would ultimately take home the Best Supporting Actor Oscar, beating out Robert Duvall, James Caan, and Pacino. It would take another 20 years before Pacino would win that lead actor Oscar, but this performance still stands alone as not needing the validation from the Academy. Pacino would team up with Jeffrey Schatzberg for a second time with the 1973 movie Scarecrow that premiered on April 11, 1973. Scarecrow tells the story of an ex-con and a homeless ex-sailor who are both trying to make their way across the US when their paths cross and they agree to travel together to help each other out. This isn't to say that you see a studio making this type of movie every year, but from the outside looking in, that seems like a pretty general setup that could have some potential. However, when I tell you that this stars Gene Hackman and Al Pacino, and they share the screen together for most of the movie, then it gets even more compelling. It's even less than a minute into the movie before Hackman and Pacino are sharing time together. This movie knows where the juice is at, and wastes no time getting there for you. Once you get the two primary actors together, it lets the story develop in a natural way that is devoid of things getting ramped up just for the sake of getting the stakes driven. It's a lot of mostly Hackman feeling out Pacino and deciding, what exactly is this guy's deal? I say all of this because I found a recent interview with Jeffrey Schatzberg from 2021, where he said that Pacino complained that in the movie he didn't receive enough screen time. The main difference in screen time is Hackman has a small, possibly romantic side arc that doesn't take too much away from the movie though. And it was only 2 years earlier that Hackman had won a Best Actor Oscar for The French Connection. So even though you're riding high off The Godfather, I don't think it would have been ridiculous to defer to Hackman here. These two actors are both at the beginning part of their acting careers, and are both locked into every scene with each other. A new side of Pacino that we did get to see is that during the last 15 to 20 minutes, a traumatic incident happens to his character, and it causes an emotional meltdown followed by him shutting down to the outside world. That's obviously not something you enjoy seeing on screen, but it was an opportunity to see just how versatile he is as an actor, and can sometimes just be pigeonholed for that patented intensity. In this case, Scarecrow got to showcase his ability to play this more lighthearted character that has a positive outlook on life, but then reacts like a normal person would when confronted with tragedy. It's a shame that Hackman and Pacino movies didn't become a genre in their own, but at least this treasure is still out in the world, even if Pacino thinks he should have been in it more. The second movie of 1973 for Pacino was Serpico from Sidney Lumet and released on December 5th, 1973. Serpico is about the exploits of a real-life whistleblower, Frank Serpico, and how he uncovered police corruption within the New York City Police Department. The performance that Pacino puts on here certainly is something to behold, but I do need to take a second to shout out all of the looks that Pacino has in the movie. As you're seeing on screen, this is only a small smattering of what he's having to offer in the movie. It's one thing to deliver a great performance, but to do that in conjunction with all of these iconic looks is pretty incredible. For this role, Pacino actually tried to spend some time with the actual Frank Serpico. Apparently it was a short-lived experiment though. Pacino said in 2011, quote, "I went out with the cops one night, did about 5 minutes of that and said, I can't do this stuff. So I would just sort of hang out around Frank and then long enough to sort of feel him," end quote. This is one of those circumstances that you have to appreciate the attempt by Pacino, and at least for me, I admire that he didn't even try to fake it. He knew right away that the things that those cops were doing and being asked to do was a little too much for him to handle. We're going to see this in another Sidney Lumet movie later on, but he is so good at establishing this genuine core in his main characters. We don't get these overcomplicated setups where the movie is trying so hard to prove how good of a person that our protagonist is. Instead, we get small moments, such as his adopting a puppy off the street, or when he begins dating a woman he genuinely takes an interest in ballet, which is one of her passions. His performance does get to lean into some of those established strengths for Pacino as an actor, but does utilize him in a kind of different way. I've been bringing up the word intensity a lot in these discussions because that's the energy that he seems to naturally exude, so it's something that he is always playing off of in a different kind of way. In The Godfather, that intensity is a gateway into this menacing confidence that he has. In Serpico, he's not a threat like that. Instead, that intensity boils over into his frustration, that this system is as rotten as it is and he's going to find some way to change it, one way or another. I try to stray away from talking too much specifically about the ending of movies especially, but this moment is too good for me to pass up. After Pacino is laid up in a hospital bed after being shot, and finally exposing the depths of the seediness in the police force, one of the senior members of the force approaches him to present him with the Golden Shield, which is something that had been alluded to throughout the movie as one of the highest honors you could receive. As Pacino is processing this moment, you can see him deciphering whether or not he is getting bestowed this honor because he is an honest cop that did the right thing, or because he got shot. Without a long diatribe explaining his thoughts, he simply says, "I don't want it." He has become so skeptical and jaded by this organization that he can't accept anything from them. I bring this up because he is able to utilize that intensity in conveying just how serious he is about not needing their approval for his actions. I obviously can't speak of how accurate the portrayal of Frank Serpico ended up being, but I can conclude that Pacino was able to make this feel like a real-life human who was fed up with the status quo, and I think this is an accomplishment that a lot of movies of this ilk don't even achieve, even though they're trying to. Pacino made his lone appearance in 1974 with the release of The Godfather Part 2, directed by Francis Ford Coppola and releasing on December 18, 1974. If you haven't seen the movie, I'm sure you can conclude that this is a continuation of the 72 movie, The Godfather. The beauty is in the structure of this though, where we have one timeline focused on Michael Corleone and his continued rise to power in the circle of one of the most powerful families in the mafia scene, and then the other timeline is all about the buildup of the Corleone family and how Don Vito was able to establish the family legacy in New York City. The movie starts with a young Vito Corleone still living in Italy and being forced to bear one unbearable situation after another. At one point, in my notes, I wrote, "I forgot how sad the start of this movie was." But then my very next note reads, "Now he has smallpox." Clearly I had no recollection of how many circumstances get stacked up against him from the outset. That side of the story has some action, but remains fairly small in a contained, good way for me. The excess lies in the other timeline where Michael Corleone is still trying to do it like his dad would have, while trying to get himself apart from that family legacy as well. There are a lot of things to point out how good Al Pacino once again is at playing Michael Corleone, but the one area that clicked for me on this go-around was the combination of fear and disdain that the characters around him have for him. His own sister has no love for him at all, and she is just having the formality of a conversation with him to get some money out of him. He did kill her husband after all, so I think that's fair. For the most part, Michael Corleone doesn't have anyone that he can talk to about this. No one else will understand the circumstance where he is treated as this very real monster in his own life. But people know that his survival is in their best interest, so they tolerate it. This does culminate in a scene where Diane Keaton is not only letting him know that she is taking the children from him, but that the miscarriage she told him about was actually an abortion, because she couldn't live with the idea of bringing another child of his into this world. Included is one of the all-time quotes from her when she tells him, "At this moment, I feel no love for you at all." This arc between the two movies of first transforming into that monster, and then having to live with that monster in your everyday life, is already going to be compelling. But having someone of Pacino's acumen sell both phases of this movie makes you feel lucky to be a movie watcher. The final movie for Pacino during this time frame was the Christmas 1975 release of Dog Day Afternoon from Sidney Lumet. As you might be able to guess, I'm already a massive fan of this movie. It combines a lot of elements that are really hard to pull off together, but when done this well, for me at least, it ends up as an American masterpiece. First, we get a heist movie. Check. Then we get an all-time great actor as the lead. Check. Then we have the movie being directed by one of the great observers of the human condition in Sidney Lumet. Check. And finally, we get a narrative that extends beyond just the heist and what that has to say about American society. Final check. Now, I of course just built this up to quite a degree, without wanting to get too into the weeds of the plot. Simply, this is about a bank heist in New York City being led by Al Pacino. What more could you want? As mentioned earlier, Lumet has a real skill for finding the good in individuals and tapping into them beyond what is visible on the surface. Throughout the movie, Pacino does have times where he is menacing. He is holding up a bank after all. At the same time, it's a very relaxed bank heist. When it comes time to release some of these captives, he makes logical decisions and even wants to make sure that everyone is comfortable and no one is too scared by what is happening. Lumet knows that the most important thing for him to establish is that Pacino is not going to shoot any of these hostages. His narrative doesn't need to be distracted by worrying in every scene that he might end up actually killing one of these people. Instead, we get to have a Pacino performance where he is frantic and worried, is this heist actually going to work? It's clear that his motivations for robbing the bank are more than just wanting a lot of money. And I want to preserve what that reasoning is, because I think the way that it plays out is not only impressive for a 1975 movie, but impressive for any movie tackling the subject matter. This performance in 1975 for Pacino is the end of a run where he was nominated for an Oscar in 4 consecutive years. Rightfully so, I might add. This role for me is my favorite of his, pretty definitively, because it is the combination of role and performance that I think translates into a level of transcendence that lets you know that you're watching something that not every actor is capable of. Honestly, that argument could be made for any of the roles in this time period. They are that good, and that's what makes him a special actor. This period is tough, because I feel like a lot of the discussion today has been about me saying, did you guys know how good of an actor Al Pacino is? But I feel like it's just as important to talk about these runs and the heights that an actor can reach when they get a good run of roles that fit them so well that they can deliver these knockout performances. It's also a funny span because over the 6 movies, Pacino worked with 3 different directors twice and was able to establish himself as this next great leading man because he was operating with people that he trusted and they knew what he was capable of. I'm never going to go into a discussion and try and shut things down and say that nobody else's opinion is valid, but I'll put it this way. I think we'll be hard-pressed to find another 5-year window for an actor or actress that covers this many movies where they're this consistently great and the movies themselves match that quality. Thanks for joining me on this episode of 5-Year Windows. If you could, leave a like on the video and subscribe down below. It would be greatly appreciated and will keep you in the loop for when the next video drops. If you have some other actors or actresses that you'd like to see covered on the show, leave those suggestions down below in the comments. Our subject next week is going to be the great career of Jennifer Lopez from 2000 to 2004. And again, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.